Awesome. All right, we'll go and get started, and then we will have a recording of this later for anyone that can't attend. Or, but if you can stay around, we're gonna have a QA section too, so you can ask questions. And then also, if you have questions, you can kind of ask throughout, and if it's like relevant to what we're talking about currently, then I'll go ahead and pose it, and then we can discuss it a little bit more. But we'll get started now, and then as other people come in, they can catch back up. All right, so your host. So we'll start webinar: single versus multiple Kubernetes clusters and building the right platform. So your hosts are me, Mike Peterson, Tech Marketing Loft Labs, and then Kurt, if you want to introduce yourself again and maybe give a little bit of
I guess
information about
sort of
yourself.
did a little bit. All right. I'm a solution architect here at Loft Labs. So I'm on the sales side. I'll do my best not to be too salesy today,
Yeah.
but and give you some good information. But yeah, no, I've been using Kubernetes for since 2017. So
Awesome.
love it.
Yeah, so I say been using it since around the same time too. There was a Kelsey Hightower, when he was at CoreOS, right between CoreOS and moving over to Google, he did a thing in Portland, and I went down and learned about it there. And then Morantis had been doing it a little bit too, so been around it a little bit. Then I didn't understand it then. Like he showed us what to do. I signed up for an account, didn't really know what was going on, but was kind of excited about it, and then started learning about it there. All right, so here's our agenda. So intro, just did that. We're gonna talk about single clusters, multiple clusters, and then QA, and then we'll have some closing. But let's start it out. So single clusters. So we're going to kind of have like 3 different sections for each of these. I'm just going to talk about like what it is, the benefits, and then some of the issues you're going to run into. So for single, maybe you're multi-tenancy focused, you have like dev, test, and preview all in the same cluster. So this is the idea of I'm just going to create one big cluster and everyone's going to use it, instead of saying I'm going to give each user their own cluster. So you're going to have multiple users and tenants on the same cluster, and you'll probably separate them out using something like namespacing or vCluster. So the cluster is going to be larger with like way more resources. So you'll have higher optimization if you've got enough people like packed onto it. And then you can spin up new nodes instead of spinning up the entire control plane. So that's some of the ideas around like a big cluster. If I say I've got a bunch of users on there and I need more worker nodes because I've run into my max amount of pods that I can run, it's a little bit easier to just add another node instead of waiting for a control plane and all that stuff to come up. But let's go ahead and see what Kurt's take is on this. How many people start out, do you think, go with like a large cluster and go directly into, multi-tenancy, or how many do you think just hand out like a cluster to everybody that you've seen? I mean, this might be 50-50 or like.
Yeah, no, seriously. I think it's like 50-50 really. You see a lot of both. And then you also see some really, really big companies hand out lots of large clusters.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Now, when you say large cluster, like how many worker nodes do you think are you talking? Like what's a large cluster to you versus a small cluster in like the enterprise?
large clusters probably like we're talking 100 nodes.
Oh,
I would
wow.
say a small cluster is, a node,
Yeah.
or 3 or 4 nodes. But yeah, there are obviously limits to how many nodes you can have, to some extent. So, yeah, I think the Kubernetes default limit is 110. Or no, 5,000. Oh, well, 5,000. There you go. 5,000 nodes actually. But then only 110 pods per node. So yeah, I mean, you see people that have over 100,000 pods running in one cluster.
So many. And then, so like, do you see someone like starts out with a single cluster? Like, do you see them start out with namespacing usually, or do they just like drop everything in default? Like, what do you usually see happening? Well, where did you see like previous jobs too? Like when you're like just starting out learning Kubernetes, what did you do?
Our product installed into its own namespace, similar to the
Okay.
way that a vCluster typically will. Well, I mean, with open source, I guess you can install multiple, but with the vCluster platform, we have one namespace per vCluster. But yeah, I mean, and actually a lot of I guess more mature Kubernetes companies, they don't even allow you to use default namespace. They'll have like a policy in place to disallow that because that doesn't really help you really define what that namespace is for, right? It's just default. And so they make you actually have to have one. And then also, I just ran into somebody the other day that they were only allowed to have 2 dashes in their namespace name
Oh.
per a policy. But so I thought that was interesting, but really not really relevant. But I just thought that was interesting. But so yeah, you have as many namespaces as you want. So namespace is very prevalent. That's used by most anybody that's gotten beyond the basics of Kubernetes usage.
It'll help you separate to like the naming of deployments and stuff, so you don't have overlap. So each person can name it my app or whatever they want if they're just starting out, or guest book.
Yeah.
Guess you don't have you're not having clash with the guest book. All right, so let me go ahead and talk about some of the benefits. So we kind of discussed, like what you start out with. So some of the benefits of like a single cluster would be cost optimization. So you can scale with worker nodes. Like I said, instead of deploying a new control plane, which could cost less, especially if you're using like EKS or something like that. You're not, or not EKS, but if you're rolling your own, EKS gives you the control plane, so just 2 more workers. Higher utilization, so more users means more usage. So if you think about like VMs previously, you're kind of over subbing, like maybe you're putting more people on there and you're waiting till you hit certain limits, and then you would just deploy more worker nodes. You can avoid clusters where there's like a single workload, which is what I ran into a lot of the time. Is someone's just doing development work, I give them an entire cluster and they're just deploying into default, and it's like a single deployment because all they need is access to Kubernetes to test something. So that's like super expensive for something they could be doing with Kind, or you could put them into like a virtual cluster or something like that, and they could do everything there. Support more types of workloads in the same cluster. Kurt, you added that. Do you want to discuss that?
I added that one. Sorry, yeah, I meant to tell you. Surprised you
No,
with
that's
that
fine.
one. Yeah, I mean, because you're not limited to just one type of node with a large cluster, especially in a whether bare metal cloud, whatever. You can have different node pools. You mentioned the auto scaling. So kind of a single cluster can grow to as big as it needs to be to the limits of Kubernetes. 5,000 nodes is pretty massive. Most cloud providers won't even let you spin up a cluster that big, probably, but by default at least. But yeah, I mean, you're going to want to utilize as much of the capacity 100% of the time as possible, especially these days with GPUs. We see that quite common, that people come to us to help them figure out how they can maximize the utilization of these resources, like the expensive GPUs.
And when you say
And a
nodes, you
large
mean like
cluster,
workers,
it's
right?
easier doing a single cluster than it is in multiple clusters.
So you're talking about like workers, right? Like, so people that are just getting Kubernetes, like this is a worker is what you're talking about. And then you're talking about like node pools and stuff to where maybe a worker's got a GPU and another worker doesn't have a GPU. And you're trying to say only people that need the GPU would maybe access that worker based on like labels or.
Well, it's funny, actually, there's some interesting schedulers for Kubernetes outside of the defaults that you have with the actual distributions. There's one called Volcano, for example, that is got a fair share scheduling, and what that allows you to do in a single cluster like this, you have all your nodes with all your GPUs in one cluster, and what it does is say, hey, if there's only one GPU workload, give all the GPUs to that workload. But as soon as another workload comes on board, they get 50%, and that fair share schedule is able to redirect that GPU usage to take it away from the one workload and give it to the other, because they don't want that GPU sitting there because that GPU is too expensive to waste. So they always want it to be maximized for usage, and those are the kind of incredible things you can do with Kubernetes.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. So basically, as you add more users, they're going to be like, wait, this is a little bit slower than I'm used to because they're sharing more than they were previously.
Yeah, but the opposite of that is worse, where you're just a GPU sitting there and you spent $50,000 on this GPU and it's just sitting there doing nothing.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So also managing and versioning is easier for the platform team because they just have like a single cluster. They can manage, the host CRDs on less clusters. They're not worried about like versioning changing between the different ones, like they've got them in different regions or something. There's less version mismatches across the platform, and then same platform stack for everybody. So these are benefits, but they're also kind of hidden, downsides, right? Like, so
Yeah.
with each of these, every benefit is also kind of like a hidden downside. So what do you think about this large platform? They just manage the single thing. I'll get to the downsides in a minute, but what are the benefits you could see beyond some of the stuff I'm talking about here, maybe?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think that covers it pretty much.
Yeah.
I'd say.
All right, cool.
I mean,
Let's go to
just
the downside.
accessing the cluster, right? It's easier, to manage that because it's just one cluster that everybody's accessing as opposed to many clusters. So
same API endpoint too. Oh, okay, so we'll get to the downsides, but the same API endpoint, and you're putting a lot of people on there too. You end up running into API issues where, like, previously I've taken down entire regions in like a previous job where I was trying to deploy, 50 clusters at the same time. Right, like underneath of the same like controllers, hosted cloud providers will usually have something like EKS where they have a control plane and then they add worker nodes in and they kind of segment them out. So like I've run into issues where just like deploying way too much and like breaking stuff. So single API endpoint can be good, but can also be like a downside. So like I said, hidden benefits. All right, so let's go ahead to the next section. So issues. So it can still be like, even though you have a single cluster, it can still be a multi-cluster platform because you have data privacy laws. You have all these different things that say I need to have a single big cluster, but I have to do it in multiple regions still. Instead of having like 20 clusters in like US East or something like that, you can have one big one, but then you may need one in US West. You may need one in Frankfurt. You may need them like in the EU in different regions because you can't have data going across, lines from the US to the EU. So it's still kind of a multi-cluster platform. It's just how big do I make my cluster in each area versus do I make a bunch of small ones? You also have single points of failure with this. Like if US East just goes down and it's a single large cluster, that might take out work for the day for like a lot of people, and you got to bring it back up, and then you don't have something backed up for it, or you don't have people spread out across where it goes down and only affects like one tenth of your users or something like that. And then there's hard limits on cloud providers that you may not run into until you really start doing larger clusters. Like there's limits on IP address space, there's limits on storage per account. Like go back to IBM. Like there are limits on how much storage you can actually create per account without having to call somebody, right? Like you might be able to try to create it, but you're gonna have to call in eventually and say, hey, can you up this and justify it? And then they'll be like, sure, you can do that. Or they may tell you that, hey, this isn't how our services define or should be used. You need to go ahead and split this up into more. So there are hard limits you can hit. Have you run into hard
Or
limits
maybe,
or
hey,
anything
we
like
have
that,
to
Chris?
install another rack. Like
Yeah.
there's actual computers running somewhere, in the cloud. So they actually might not have the capacity to give you, if you're running in the cloud versus your own bare metal.
So what are some of the issues you think you've run with like single cluster, like the API, like having a single API endpoint,
Well, I
right?
mean, like
Like,
you mentioned, all the pros can be switched around to be issues.
yeah,
The load on the API server and just another little vCluster plug there. Right away, a vCluster is going to reduce the load on that underlying host API server because it has its own. They're still going to make calls to the underlying, but they're only for certain things, not for everything. So right away, by running vClusters for that small overhead of running the vCluster control plane pod, you get a reduction on the load of the actual host API server. But yeah, I mean, still like platform stack, it's easier to manage, but it's one platform stack. You're stuck with whatever versions the platform team gave you. So if you want to use a different version of like an ingress controller, too bad.
yeah.
Again, that's not the case with vCluster. So vCluster does solve a lot of those issues for larger single clusters. But yeah, pretty much all the pros can be turned around into to issues or cons.
And you run into like network issues and all, yeah, anything with computers that you're used to, Kubernetes is going to run into the same type of things because it's still just running on these computers. So networking issues like latency and stuff like that. If you just got everyone hitting the same thing, everything's running in the same spot, or you're just going to pay a lot for better networking and more bandwidth, right? Like you might be
Well,
able
and
to
you
pay
mentioned
out.
CRDs too.
Yeah.
Any global resource like CRDs, again, you're not going to be able to like use different CRDs. We're talking. I'm not going to mention the customer name, but we were
Yeah.
talking to a customer recently, and they so a developer and deleted a CRD that they thought they were the only one using, but it turned out the entire organization was using. All the developers were using CRD, and were no longer able to get any work done for a couple of days. Yeah. Having like cluster wide resources that are stuck at the specific version makes it harder to test changes and so forth.
All right, so we're gonna move on to multi-cluster, but if anyone has questions, queue them up in Q&A or ask them in the chat, and then we'll also try to answer them while we're on here. So now let's talk about multiple clusters, right? So this is the idea of like, maybe I'm gonna deploy, instead of one cluster in US East, I'm gonna have, 3 to 4, and then I'm gonna give those to different teams, and it's gonna kind of be split up that way instead of saying I've got one large cluster. So like maybe, dev, test, preview gets their own cluster instead of being all on the same. And then users and tenants each get their own cluster. And then the users may even be able to manage their own clusters within their team or groups instead of having the platform team say you can only use this version of something because they may have different requirements, right? But all this is kind of benefits and good stuff, but it's also, we'll go down to the downsides.
Mm-hmm.
These are all downsides too, because you're going to run into issues where one team is using one version of something and your other team's using a different version of something, and maybe one of the versions is not supported anymore. So then you have to reach out to that team and say, you have to update this or you have to upgrade this, and then it's on them to do it. So it's a lot more like, I won't say micromanaging, but like kind of micromanaging different groups to make sure that they're keeping up with their security practices. And it can become a headache pretty quickly. And we'll get to costs and
Yeah.
stuff like that too. So what do you think you should use a multi-cluster for instead of a single cluster? Like what kind of use cases would you see that being benefit for?
Well, like something you mentioned in the previous slides, like for the different countries, data
Yeah.
laws, that sort of thing. Just extra layers of security when you need hard, tenancy security. Then it's sometimes the only way to do it. Also, maybe you want to have clusters on-prem and cloud. So that's not. There are some solutions that some of the cloud providers have that can do that to some extent. To I guess with one cluster, sort of. But yeah, those are I guess some of the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
And then like, yeah, like, so you're saying that some one team might like, a certain region, and then they like a certain data center in that region. And like maybe you've got everything deployed to like US East 1, and then the team's like, I don't like that one. That it goes down too often when it's there. Like I want everything in
Mm.
like 3 or something like that, because they just rolled a newer version, or US East 3 now has Kubernetes, and they just added that in like last month. Let's try this since there's less people there, right? Like there's all kinds of weird planning things that come in, and also some like judgments based on previous experiences, at least that I've experienced, where people have a preference for like within even each region a certain like specific like data center or something like that, which is pretty weird, but like it's something you might run into too. So you might run into
Well,
multi-cluster
actually,
requests for that.
like that's good. There really isn't a true multi-region Kubernetes cluster today. Like,
Yeah.
so for disaster recovery as well is another good reason to have multiple clusters. If you don't want to, take the like just to speed up the recovery time, the meantime, the recovery, you actually have another cluster running with everything on it, that you can switch over to with like some global DNS. So that's another, strong use case for it, I would say.
Good point too. Yeah. Like so single cluster, there is no real like switching over to something. But you're saying you're like DNS rules, and then also like just setting up like a load balancer to send traffic between the two too. That way you're not also overloading a certain one, and then have stuff running different places. Then use like a service mesh or something like that, I guess, to distribute traffic. Like what would be your I want to talk about Istio and go into like stuff like that, but like it's kind of when you
Yeah,
get
I
to after
mean
you've deployed.
that is possible. Yeah, you do. You can. There are service meshes that support multi clusters. So that
Yeah.
I'm not a networking
I think
expert
it's very
by any
complicated.
means, but yeah. So, but yeah, I mean the use cases you show here though, like most of those are, I have to say, much better served by vClusters than by separate
Yeah.
and physical clusters. Like the dev
Um,
test preview, each developer getting their own cluster, that sort of thing. That's one area where vCluster really shines.
so the
Because
question
one
is
of the
like,
things, well, we'll get to the
but
cons in a second. Like
yeah, yeah.
underutilization of these clusters is a real problem.
It's like, do I want to pay for a cluster just to do dev and test? Like, what's the biggest difference between these, that I can't just have all of my things running there? They're not production. I don't care if they like. I kind of care if they go down, but it's not as big of a deal. I'm not going to lose money if they go down, right? But like, should I have one for each, or like, would it be better just to have a single law? I would, for dev test preview with vCluster like that, I would just say have one, right? But you may have different laws and rules also, that like you've got dev in a certain region, and then you've got someone else that's doing QA in another region, right? Like to where you can't have it deployed in the same spot and share that information. All right, so let's go to some of the benefits. So benefit of multi-cluster is probably less impact from RBAC issues and multi-tenancy on the platform team. If you're just giving everyone their own cluster, you're probably not really worried about, you know, another tenant or something like that having access and trying to keep them from overwriting what the other people are doing. Like you're just like, you do it yourself. I need to manage at least the version of Kubernetes that you're running to make sure that you're within our policies, but you do what you want within reason, right? Like unless it's production, they probably have a lot more security rules. And each cluster can be created, wherever you need it. So different regions, more reliable data centers, closer to the user. There's minimal management for the platform team. There's a little asterisk there because, like I said, you still need to make sure that people are upgrading their version to Kubernetes. If you've got stuff running on them saying that this version of an image has issues, you need to make sure that they're updating their images, right? Like there's still all these things that you have to manage, even if you're giving these to people, if you have to stay within security guidelines. But for the most part, users can manage their own. They can install any CRD and everything that they want. All this is kind of leading up to, yeah, we were talking about vCluster here in a few minutes, but like how does this get easier with something like vCluster or some other options? But these are kind of the benefits. Some of these are downsides too. You have any comments on some of the benefits, Kurt, or any stories?
Yeah, the other benefit too is like the versus the having a single platform stack with a large single cluster. These individual tenants that have their own cluster can kind of install whatever tools they want. So they're not stuck with, if you're using Ingress Engine X, they can use Istio or vice versa. So they can test out new things maybe that you're not willing to do in a single cluster. That's going to where that serves that controller, that operator is going to be shared across the entire cluster. Um, but but yeah, no, this definitely.
Well, I love how every benefit is literally also an issue, right? Like every single,
Sure.
like each one of those, because like you think, okay, this is great. I'm going to give each one of my users their own cluster. They're going to go off and they're going to, deploy their own stack. They're going to decide on what they want to use and what benefits them the most. And then you meet together again in a year and you're trying to get like a platform actually deployed, or you're trying to serve up like your SaaS or something like that. And you realize you've got 20 different teams using 20 different things, and you can't get on one single thing for production anymore because they've been testing on all these other things and there's all these new
Yeah,
dependencies that you didn't expect, right?
that's a good
But
point.
then also,
That is a
how do
good point.
you can't have innovation either if you are too restrictive. So it's like,
Yeah,
what's most important to me is what you really need to think about with all of this stuff. Like where I want to be in a year from now, maybe, or a couple years from now, instead of like, what do I want to do to make it easy today? All
yeah.
right. Let's go to issues. So some of the multiple cluster issues, like very expensive. It's very expensive, right? If you're spinning up a cluster for everybody that comes in and asks you for a cluster, then you're like, in my experience, I was spinning up between 1 and 3 node clusters, right? But that's spinning up, usually it's 3. Usually I was spinning up at least 3. So I got to pay for 3 virtual machines. I have to pay for the storage behind it. I have to pay for all of this stuff, the bandwidth and all that. And I'm doing it for each user. At first it's not super expensive, but like as you have 30, 40, 50 users, it's going to be super expensive, right? Like it's absurd. So it'll sneak up on you. Cleanup can be painful too. So some of the things with some of the cloud providers, like they'll give you some insight into what is backing this if you're using like a EKS or EKS is probably a little bit better, but like IBM, we had like IBM Cloud, whatever, but IBM Kubernetes, but there was storage behind it that would be preserved that I had to go map out as a platform person and figure out where does the storage exist? How do I delete this? Because it's preserved because they assume I want to keep it in case I want to deploy something else and get that data. So there could be like weird cleanup scripts and everything that you have to start writing just to be able to go back and make sure that you get rid of everything when you've deployed all these. And then replicating like the platform stack across all clusters can be pretty complicated. Kurt, you got anything on that, or I'll keep going?
I mean, I think also one other very expensive comment is just the underutilization of these
Yeah.
individual clusters. So, which is just throwing money down the drain.
Well, especially if even if you're using something, let's say you're using something like OpenShift, right? Like which has licensing associated with it too. If you're spinning it up for some providers, like you may be paying for a license for that entire month and it's not prorated. I think they've gotten better and some of the stuff is prorated now to where you're only paying for like usage. But like if you're not getting prorated things too, and you just like spun up something for like a user and they just use it for like a day or two and you're paying for like a month, or it just doesn't get deleted, like it's so expensive. Like, and then you've wasted money on something that you could have, just thrown them in a bigger cluster and use like something like vCluster to where like it doesn't matter if they used it or not because with like an enterprise solution you can just spin it down when they're not using it and then you can save money that way. So we'll kind of get to some of that. But then like so versioning across clusters can be different. We kind of touched on that when we were talking about 20 different groups using 20 different things and each person trying to figure out how to do it themselves, and like there's no communication or documentation and they're just like, hey, this thing looks cool, let me go try it. Security issues can kind of go ignored if you're not really like looking into what they're doing or monitoring everything. Like if you're just, hey, here's a cluster for like a POC, go do what you're doing. Like they might be using old images for things. They might be using versions that you don't want them to use. Or like I said, they may not update their Kubernetes cluster because they don't use it. And it might be sitting there for like a year and it runs out of support. And then like, where do you draw the line at who gets a cluster? Like, is it per user, per team, per tenant, or per group? Like, where's that line drawn? That's something I think about when you start doing a cluster for everybody. It's like, I would say I did per user at first, but then like per team is something we were thinking about. This is like 2019 or so like that. We're trying to think, do I give it per user? Do I give it per team or something like that? But there's pushback when I try to do it per team because each user wanted their own thing and they didn't want to have to worry about anybody else. Right. So
Yeah.
I don't know, Kurt, if you got
That's
some
crazy.
stuff on.
I mean, having a physical cluster per user, imagine organizations that got 10,000 developers. I mean, that gets insane.
So we had an account that was like, I think we had about 120 or so like that developer advocates in my group, and it was all under one account. So first of all, that was the wrong thing to do because the cloud providers don't necessarily want you to put 100 users in a single account. They expect you to do more of like a tenant-based thing where a team might get an account, or like maybe a smaller group of users, maybe put 20 to 30, but we hit 100, 120. And that's how we started hitting a lot of these limits, right? Because it wasn't just storage that was issues, it was service IDs. So IDs associated with a person that allowed you to do specific things within that account, there's a limit on those too, right? Like if you've got too many of those and you have to like, can you upgrade this? Or like, well, you might as well just create another account. So there's all these little weird things that you can run into. Like you probably don't want 100 people in there. But realistically, what you want to get to is not having users touch Kubernetes at all, which is kind of what I was hinting at like the last webinar. If you can get it to where no one's actually touching it, you don't have to worry about RBAC for them. They're just putting stuff, this is your specialty, and I'll get you to talk about it in a minute, putting stuff into GitHub, and then you're using automated tools to deploy to this stuff, then it doesn't really matter which one of these you choose because you're not giving tenants a cluster. You're just giving them access to the the platform that deploys something for them, which they don't really, not all these users care about accessing a Kubernetes cluster and doing kubectl. They just want to develop and they just want to see what the result is. They want to look at the preview. What's your experience with that, Kurt? Did your developers still want access to the cluster, or did you make it easier for them and they're just like, I don't need to touch it. Just make it so that I can just deploy something to GitHub, which is what I know, like, or do a PR.
A little bit of both. I mean, there are developers that just can't help
Yeah.
but want to learn more about Kubernetes because it's interesting and it's an important part of the ecosystem now. So they're, they want to learn the innards of it and not just necessarily write their application code. But I think an organization that is developing software probably wants them to focus more on their application code. Because at the end of the day, that's what they're there really for. They're not there necessarily to manage Kubernetes.
So this is the joke that I always saw like when I was supporting developers, is like every developer wanted to write their own library for something, even though it already existed out there. So some people want to be more hands-on and touch things and learn about them and make it so they can do it. They can do it better or differently, right? Like, and then some are just like, I don't care, just do it for me because it makes it easier on me.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think in my time at CloudBees, we had a team of about 20 sales engineers, and I'd say maybe a handful of them really had any interest in actually touching and getting into the innards of Kubernetes. The rest just wanted an environment. They just wanted what they needed to do their demos, etc. And they didn't care about Kubernetes that much, except for what they needed to know for, from a sales perspective. But they didn't want to spin up our tools, our product in it. They didn't want to deal with Kubernetes. So it depends.
Awesome. All right, so I don't have any questions or anything queued up yet. So what we'll do is we'll go over to not closing, but kind of we'll talk a little bit here for a few, and then if you have questions or anything like that, just let us know. So all of this is kind of like getting into which Kurt, I'll give you like the upsell, the vCluster stuff, right? Like, so basically for both of these, you can use vCluster. So it can help in multi-tenancy in almost any scenario. So we're saying what is vCluster? vCluster spins up. Well, you tell us what vCluster is, Kurt, and then I'll go through the slides.
Okay. vCluster basically is a virtual Kubernetes cluster that runs in a host cluster as a stateful set. So basically a pod. Within that pod, you have a dedicated Kubernetes API server from one of the distributions that the vCluster distribution supports. The two big ones are plain vanilla Kubernetes and K3s. After that, there's like the syncer. That's kind of the brains of a vCluster, and that's the core code of the vCluster project itself that syncs certain things from the virtual cluster into the host cluster, like pods and services. The way the architecture is designed, that they have to be synced really to make vClusters work. And then the benefit of that, though, is that you get 100% native performance for the pods and services. But then after that, you get to decide what gets synced or not synced. So you can share that large cluster's platform stack, for example, with a vCluster, because you can sync whatever resources that platform stack interacts with. Like an ingress controller needs an ingress resource. So you then configure that vCluster to sync ingress resources to the host, and you're able to leverage that ingress controller running on the host. Flip that around, say there's CRDs that are installed on the host cluster, and you want to test new versions of that same CRD. You can deploy those to a vCluster. You just don't sync them. They remain virtual. They can interact with a controller or an operator that you install in that vCluster as well. And you can have multiple versions of the same CRD in the same cluster by using vClusters. So that's just real quick overview.
Okay, yeah. So for practical sessions on vCluster, we've got office hours, we've got some other videos, and we'll probably start showing off some keep tuned to us in like the next couple of weeks, and you'll see something kind of more about like showing off some of the vCluster stuff. Like we've got some plans on that. But yeah, we've got some videos and some other things. But basically, a great way of explaining like, hey, let's give each user their own API endpoint to where everyone thinks that they've got their own Kubernetes cluster. So you get the benefits of using like maybe a single cluster, but people think that you're doing a multi-cluster setup. So like if I go back to my history, is like I would have loved to have this in 2018 or so that instead of giving each user their own cluster or even access to it, I'm just doing a single big cluster in each region, or maybe a couple of larger clusters in each region, and then I'm giving users access to it through a vCluster instead of saying, hey, I got to spin up another cluster. So that's going to save me money. And then it'll also allow me to have multi-tenancy in each of those clusters. But then you can expand on it and think about, okay, I've done this for my users. Like I'm just starting out, they're doing development, they're testing. I can do this for applications too. So if I want to have multi-tenancy for applications, I've got a SaaS product and I don't have restrictions that say, that each user has to be on their own specific node for something, then what I can do is split up my Kubernetes cluster and give access to the SaaS to multiple people. Or you can also do node, you can isolate it per node too, right, Kurt? You can say,
Sure.
hey, I only,
Yeah.
yeah. You can
Yeah,
you can say, I
100%.
want my virtual cluster. Sorry, go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, no, exactly. If you want to, I mean, you have the flexibility with vCluster to spread the vCluster workloads across all the nodes in the cluster just automatically, and that's the default way. But you can also use taints, tolerations, node selectors, and you could just target specific nodes for specific vCluster and have it be the only tenant on that node. So it is really flexible as far as that goes.
Goes back to your GPU stuff too, right? Like you could say, make sure that this virtual cluster has access to a GPU, or make sure this
Right?
virtual cluster
Yeah.
has access to a node with a lot of CPUs that it needs to be able to access. Because I might have pods that have a request for what, like 10 or 20 CPUs, or like 30, or some crazy thing someone asked for. Going back to like virtual machines, and I would have people ask me, can I get a virtual machine with, 256 gigs of memory? I was like, well, my physical nodes don't even have that much, so I can't really give that to you. It sounds like you need to go buy like a bare metal node or something like that to be able to hit this limit. So like you may have requests for like ridiculous size pods or something like that, or you might have stuff that is like data science stuff that actually has a requirement that it gets more memory and that it gets more storage space, so or more storage and CPU, so they can actually run its workloads. So that's what the taints and stuff and the different things will actually help you specify which one you're gonna deploy to, which is super good because then you can have
256
different
gigs,
worker
that's like a
size.
medium size now, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is like 2000. Okay, so this is aging, but
Yeah.
this is like 2012 or 2011, right? Like where
Right.
like that's going to be kind of expensive. Well, bare metal on-prem, like it's going to take me like a couple of months to actually order a server that size, make sure that like the vendor has it, they can send it to me. Like it's a spin up. And I'm like, largest one I've got is got like 128 and I've got like 10 of them. So I can't give you that. Um,
Yeah, and one of
what
the
else?
things we talked about earlier was like underutilization, especially in the
Yeah.
multi-cluster scenario. Uh, just from a, you can pause vClusters, but even better than that, with the commercial offering we have something called sleep mode that automatically scales down all the pods in a vCluster, the control plane and the workload. So that helps. We recently worked with a customer in a POC, and we saw 65% savings
Oh,
by
wow.
just having their, and this was in developer environments. By the way, their nodes were 256 gigs of memory, but they're basically spinning down all the workloads for the developers at night and be able to save that much money. So, they were going $15 million a year down to, you know, $5 or $6 million a year. So by using sleep mode with vCluster. So
It's crazy how different it is now than it was like 6 or 7 years ago, where like people didn't care about that and they were just like spin up clusters to try stuff. Now it's like everything's too expensive. Like the cloud, you got stuck with a cloud provider, and it's like, well, I'm not locked in, but you're kind of locked in. Like, and then you're like,
well, it's not so just that it's not it's cheaper. Right? Hardware is cheaper. It's just
yeah,
there is just so many more Kubernetes clusters than there was 10 years ago. It's just insane the number of Kubernetes clusters that organizations have, or size of those Kubernetes clusters. So
so I've got a personal website I'm trying to run. Am I running that on Kubernetes? Like what kind of workload do you think people should actually put on Kubernetes, right? Like there's certain, you say everything should be on Kubernetes, but
I don't know about that. I mean, I'm actually my website runs on GitHub for free.
yeah,
My
yeah,
blog. So but that probably runs on Kubernetes.
yeah, probably.
Even though I don't manage it, but yeah. I mean, I have Kubernetes on my Raspberry Pi.
Yeah,
So why not run your web, whatever you want, your personal web application on Kubernetes?
it's true. All right, so I guess then like we have many other questions. So yeah, here's some information that you can check out. Like here's a GitHub for vCluster if you want to check it out. Here's our Slack information, documentation on vCluster, and then we also have some like getting started stuff. So like if you're just running like a single cluster and thinking about multi-tenancy, I would recommend checking this out. Deploying Hello World container Kubernetes. Yeah, it's a good starting point, right? But then like you're gonna the good part about Kubernetes, I think the learning curve, especially now with the different tools, is something like I deploy a cluster, I get my application running, and then I give access to developers that want to run their application. They deploy to default too, and we've got overlap. And then I realize, hey, I need namespaces. And then you deploy namespaces, and then you realize, oh no, I've got to manage permissions between all this stuff with namespacing. That's too complicated. What's the thing that can help you with this? Virtual clusters, right? Because then you're actually segmenting them off. You don't have to worry about as much rules and stuff to make sure that they can't interact with each other. Each of them can still deploy the defaults. They don't have to learn how to use Kubernetes or change namespaces for every deployment and stuff like that. But I think that's kind of like I was just explaining that to someone on Slack the other day when they were talking about getting something deployed. I was like, well, make sure it works on your base Kubernetes cluster first, get all that working, and then start looking into multi-tenancy and segmenting stuff off. All right, but here's our other social information. This will get posted to YouTube probably in the next couple of hours. So if you want to rewatch this or if you want to share it with somebody, you can go ahead. And thank you so much for joining. We should have some more of these coming up in the next couple months too. And then we also have some vCluster office hours coming up in case you have questions. And then we got something on the horizon too. I think it'll be interesting to people that want to just kind of see how stuff works. But thank you for your time, Kurt. I don't know if you've got any. Yeah.
Just one real quick thing. I a little sales pitch here. But the actual platform I mentioned, like that had sleep mode. You can install it and get a 14-day free trial. And we also have a free tier. Limited set of features. But so if you want to actually see how you can manage vClusters at scale, you can check that out.
Awesome. All right. Thank you everybody for joining. We'll see you next time.